And Jasmine, do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Jasmine Millington. I am the student intern for the Decolonising the Curriculum initiative at Edinburgh Napier University. I've been with the project, I first worked with them last summer, and then they liked me enough to bring me back, so I've been with them again since January of this year.
And there are many things we could talk about today from, I don't know if there's double mic there. There are many things we could talk about today, not least the process of working with student interns, of recruiting student interns, who have lived experience, which is so important. But we won't talk about that today. Today we're going to talk about, and hopefully this session outlines it here, we're going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in the last year. And I think particularly we're going to talk about some of the work we've been developing in the last month as a result of the conversations we've been having. And it feels like, and if we could just move on to the next slide, in a way this, and I should, before I move on to the next slide, this slide is important because it highlights people. I don't think there's anyone in the room, but people who have been involved in this cluster, and it's been a really, honestly, these meetings are an utter joy. We come together, we often rant and rage and share stories of frustration, and we'll come on to talk about that a little bit more, but for just now that's just some of the names, and there are a few names on there that should be there that aren't, who have joined recently. So just on the next slide then, this is why it matters. So we wanted to start with the Jackie Kay. Some of you may know her as our former Scottish poet maker. It's now not her. And she says it takes more than one tongue to tell a story. And in a way, the tongue is not what we're going to be focusing on today, or the plurality of language. What we're going to be focusing on is the importance of lots of stories. And it ties in really nicely to our keynote this morning when we were hearing about the importance of conversation, and I guess of exchanging stories, but of stories that need to be heard and the spaces that we need to create to hear some of those stories. So the sort of three main things that came out of our work last year, and the definition that we have is up here around decolonisation, is firstly why it's happening, and I think that's become very clear in the course of the year. The second thing is the urgency with which it has to happen. So we've heard a lot throughout the year of a lot of the stories that our students and colleagues are sharing, the kind of experiences that they're having that are not acceptable actually in our universities. So how do we stop it? And that urgency is important. And I suppose the final thing that's really come out of it, and Jasmine has taught me a lot, is how much we have to learn from our students. And actually, because of the structures and the infrastructures of our universities and our university systems, and because of whose voices are allowed in the room, because of whose voices are paid to be in the room, that makes it difficult. So I don't know if you would add anything at that point, Jasmine, but just that role of staff-student partnership is absolutely critical.
Yeah, it's been an incredible experience to work at this kind of level where coming into the space as a student and then seeing a little bit behind the scenes of the infrastructures, as you mentioned, but also the deliberation that goes on between the staff members. It's been so insightful. I'm really grateful to being able to be part of this project, but particularly just between the both of us and also other members of staff at Edinburgh Napier University. It's been quite an experience having to because we want to help each other. And in that process, you need to go into places and share experiences that have already happened, but also experience new experiences. And once those things come to pass, you then need to figure out how to verbalize those things in a way that means that everybody in the room has a takeaway from it. And so in that case, when it happens between me and Catriona, nothing bad, nothing major, but just an interaction that we'll have. And it will go down in my mind as a bing, oh, that's something strange, or something unusual, something different. And I have to figure out how to make everything slot together so that it can come forth and it can actually be made of use to improve things or to keep on things that are already really good that we should continue doing in the institution.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly my own assumptions, my own prejudices, my own mistakes have been laid very bare for me, and that's an important process to go through. If we could just move on to the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a very brief snapshot of some of the stuff that's emerged in the last year. And then we're going to move on to a little activity, and I'm afraid we're going to make you talk to each other. I think quite often by this point in the day, we just want to sit in a little chair and be all cozy, but no, we're going to make you talk to each other. So that's later on, and then we'll hopefully have a chance to come back and discuss at the end. Where the project is now, this is one of our Miro boards, and you can see just from the titles there, the importance of language, which is something that came out very strongly this morning, what's happening, and then student involvement. So just in the next slide, we've highlighted some of the what's happening, because there is so much work starting in this area in all of our universities across Scotland and our colleges as well. And I think these are just a snapshot of some of the ideas or the practices that we've gathered of things that are happening at Abertay. It's interesting to see how some of this work is institutional and is happening across the institution. It's also interesting to see how much of it is taking place in the disciplines, and we've been contacted by quite a lot of colleagues who are saying, I want to do this in my discipline, where do I start, what do I do, and that's brilliant. So these conversations are definitely starting. I think the challenge is, what do we do next? So sort of going back to that idea of urgency and going back to that idea of involving our students and listening to our students. How do we do that? And I think that's something that's coming across very strongly. But it is exciting. I realise they're all Edinburgh focused or East Coast focused. That's a pure coincidence. There is nothing to read into that at all. But there is a lot of work, and we will be collating this and sharing it with the sector after the kind of project this year has come to an end, so watch this space. Just moving on to the next slide then. At our last cluster meeting, for anyone who's in the room who was there, something quite interesting happened, in that I think we were all quite tired, and we started sharing why this work was challenging. There was a lot of feeling of we've hit a wall. So yes, there's all this activity happening. Yes, there's these conversations starting. This is brilliant. But actually, why are we still having these same conversations? Why a year on has nothing really changed? And so a lot of frustration came out there. And I think just highlighting again on the next slide, some of these challenges is really important. So for example, how do we engage those who are not in the room and who don't see that there is a problem? These are all post-its from kind of random cluster people. Not random, it's just the notes from them are random. So we do have a lot of colleagues who are not engaging with this work. We do have a lot of colleagues who don't see there is a problem. And again, that came up in the keynote this morning, is going to come up later on with some of the stuff we're looking at. This kind of middle quote here that really focuses a bit that idea of the burden and the debt that we're asking of those students, particularly those students who have lived experience. So how can we meet in the middle? And we're hoping that in this session we'll begin to think about how we can meet in the middle a little bit more, because that's important. This question of expertise and who has the right to do this work is interesting. I'm standing here as a white woman. My family go back, we were probably in potato fields forever, I don't know, but very, very white and very, very kind of monocultural, if you like. And I think that notion of being a critical ally, of allyship, but also of listening, is absolutely critical here. But what does expertise mean, and why does it matter? And I think that'd be an interesting question for you to explore as well. And these last points here is how, I suppose it highlights how difficult a lot of this work is, and how are we building it into workloads at a time when staff, it's difficult work to do, it's work that a lot of staff don't want to do. And we're saying, actually, you've got to do this. You've got to confront your own prejudices. You've got to confront often your own racist attitudes. And how do we get people to do that? So it's a challenge. And that's same people. Next slide, I think. Oh yes, now this is a brilliant quote. I don't know if any of you know the Turkish author, Elif Shafak. But she's written a very powerful book recently, and this idea of stories bring us together, but untold stories keep us apart. Now, Jasmine's got an interesting take on this quotation. It's, as ever, these conversations are fascinating because we often see things from very different perspectives. So for me, sharing these stories, listening to these stories is a big part of what we have to do. And actually, by creating these spaces, we can hear some of these stories that are invisible, that are not being told, that are not being shared. But I think you had a bit of a different view, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, like broadly, I agree with the sentiment that you've come forth with your interpretation of it. But when I read this quote, I originally thought, well, it's one thing on the side that you have, which is, makes sense, I'd agree. But on the other hand, it felt a little bothersome, because to me, a lot of the time when I hear these stories told to me, or when I come forth with my own stories of any experiences, positive or negative, sometimes it's that the sharing of those stories creates the division, because it highlights to other people, hey, I've experienced this experience, and that is distinctly different from anything that another person might ever see or experience in their lifetime. And that highlighting of the division between the demographics can be something that people feel forced apart by, but also they feel uncomfortable with. And that discomfort, I feel like, is a completely different style of discomfort when it comes to these uncomfortable discussions. So both ways, I'd say our interpretations have their own meanings to them, which is why it's really important to have these conversations.
Absolutely, and these diverse perspectives, and I'm sure you'll have your own interpretation of that quotation as well. If we just move on to the next slide then, we are going to pass over to Jasmine, who's going to share more of the student voices.
Do you want me to like the camera? Yeah, so for the student part of, I'll step away from that. So the student part of the project, well, first of all, those of you in person who have seen outside in the main waiting area the 4 pictures, 2 of which are those ones. These were from last summer's work with myself and 3 other student interns. And these images were products of a lot of discussion behind the scenes that we had, both on hours and out of hours, just sharing our experiences and really sort of getting to know each other, but getting to know the space between us, in as much that it joined us as well as, you know, put us apart in our different ways. That didn't feel negative, and it didn't feel divisive. It just felt like something that simply was, and it deserved discussion. And born of that discussion were those 4 images. So if you would like to leave those comments, if you haven't already, either in person or I believe there's an online version in the online portal. So those 4 images were outputs from last summer's work. Going forward, there are actually a set of student podcasts planned. There are 6 in total, one of which has already been recorded. I'm hosting all 6 of them, as narcissistic as that might sound. But they aim to make the discussion of decolonising the curriculum something more approachable and tangible, not just to students, but to staff as well. Because what I find is that when I mention to my friends or my classmates or, you know, anybody else that I happen to talk to, oh, I'm doing this project about decolonising the curriculum, they'll register what that word means as a word by definition, but they might not have the contextual knowledge or contextual comfort to draw their own correlations and therefore get deeply invested into the conversation, not for lack of wanting to, but simply the support for the conversation isn't there yet. So the aim of these podcasts is to explore decolonising in a way that feels a bit closer to home, not to dim it down or to dumb down the subject, but to entice people into feeling more open and comfortable to discussing something that really does need discussion and needs to be worked upon in the whole sector as well as broadly in everybody's lives, I would say. And lastly, we have examples of some other advanced HE resources, which were a set of student interviews and feedback responses that were given in anonymity to advanced HE, and then they were given to actors so that these actors would take these responses verbatim, removing any identifying information, of course, and posit them to the audience in a way that protected the identity of the individuals coming forward while retaining the human nature of these confessions and experiences. Hopefully in doing so, we'll see in the examples in a moment, you'll see the raw human emotion behind them, and also I believe it makes it more tangible in its own way, to see the impacts of the work that we're doing. It's quite difficult sometimes, I think, for students and staff to see and even to conceptualize the effect of what we're doing, especially when we get high up into the academic terms and into the frameworks and all of the other structures and things like that. I think these clips are really, really useful to sort of bring it back down to earth of how and why we're doing these things. So if we could advance to the slide and we see if the video hopefully works. Oh. So it's just an embedded video, so hopefully. Hey.
You're being too sensitive on this matter. You're just a student and don't understand this.
As much as I am conceived to be loud, as of yet my voice is unheard.
No matter how loud I'm perceived to be, my voice is still unheard.
I'm written off as an angry black woman. People expect me to be argumentative.
I'm written off as the angry Latina woman. I'm the squeaky wheel of my group.
You are double-bound. Told what you can talk about. That's not how we do things here. And how we should talk about it. That's not the right way to approach this. To keep the status quo, which hasn't worked.
Right. So, those are a series of acted interviews. There's a lot more of those available, a whole series of them. I believe the links will be available somewhere. They'll be disseminated. If not, you can email me. Just to expand on a little bit about the work going forward for the student podcast, as mentioned, there are 6 of them planned. We did make sure to include as much variety in the participants as possible to really get into the meat of the matter of making decolonising the curriculum a tangible and approachable topic across all disciplines and as many institutions as possible. So the one that's already been recorded is a teaser. You can look forward to it when it gets put up and hosted, is with Paula, who is actually our only international guest from Puerto Rico. Of course, lots of history of colonization and difficult practices and sensitive discussion. So of course, when you listen to it, please be warned, but ultimately, yeah, so you can look forward to these resources as they come forward. We can move to the next slide. Or not. There we go.
So we're going to do some storytelling, and from this activity we're going to get you to go into your little activity. So this was something that we came up with in conversation. And the idea came up from actually quite a lot of conversations that I've been having with particularly international students, but we often hear of the challenges around assessment and feedback. We often hear about some of the confusion, some of the misperceptions, and yeah, so it seemed an obvious example to choose. So there's been an essay, it's been submitted. And I'm going with essay, and that's a whole other topic in itself, because should we be going with essays? 0 to 100% marking scheme. Each of the students, 5 students submitted an assignment, the same assignment, the essay, not the same one, but they each got 65%, and what we're going to see is that each of these students responded very, very differently. Now, Jasmine and I are going to do something which I worry is a little bit cringy, but apparently we interpret cringy differently, so I don't know if my interpretation is the same as yours. But we're going to take the perspectives of the student and the teacher, because what we feel is that, and what we can see, what we've heard, is that it's this kind of what a former student of mine called this chasm between staff and students. You know, we're kind of both frustrated, we're annoyed, we don't talk to each other. So it's trying to kind of get in between those dialogues and languages and go there. So if we just move on to our 5 students then, it's the next slide. Well, they're not actual students, you just have to picture them, they're imaginary.
That's why it's narrative.
That's why it's narrative, exactly, so it's imaginary. So these very different responses then, so we have the kind of content student, yeah, that's great, 65%, cool. One who's upset, so very used to getting very, very high grades from the country that she comes from, and so kind of this doesn't help her experience of being a student. Then you have the confused student. So why did I get this mark? Why is it so low? The feedback comments seem fine. Why is it only 65? The angry student, and then the elated student. So kind of, oh wow, this is brilliant. I didn't understand anything that I was doing, and I've got 65%. That's great. So. Usually me. So if we move on to the next slide, then we're going to try and imagine a little bit the sort of thoughts that are going through our students' heads. And we're going to start with the contented student.
Yeah, I'm just going to stand up so we can sort of re-see the dialogue as it's happening, even though in this sort of narrative exercise, we're not directly talking to each other, but we're talking to you as the viewer who has access to the fourth wall. You can see the engagement and overlap of the experiences and the stories, even though we as the characters in the stories can't actually see that. So if we start with the side of the contented student, if I embody that character, so let's begin acting exercise. I've never taken acting in my life. So my name is Ellie, and when I came to university, I just sort of, I muddled through high school, was all right with it, got good grades, made my conditional offer, everything was, as it was. I feel like I sort of understood what I was doing enough that I didn't really feel like I had to ask questions. So I put together all my work. I had some nights out with my mates, did the work as well, did most of the exercises. Of course, I skipped some lectures, but who doesn't? And ultimately, I feel like I understand my grade. Like, I'm quite comfortable with where it's at. I don't know if it really, affects me or impacts me, thinking I want to get higher or I feel bad that I didn't do as well as I wanted. But ultimately, I get where I am. It's just sort of the way it is.
And I'm Professor Peddle, and I marked this piece of work, and I have to say, I have no idea who this student is. She's one of about 500 students in my lecture. I think she might come to tutorials, but to be honest, so many of them say nothing. They literally just sit there and don't talk to me. I have no idea what's going on. I was just really happy to mark this assignment because it only took me an hour as opposed to the 2 hours that many of the other ones take me. And actually, I just need to be getting on with this grant that I've got to finish by Friday. So yeah, I'm a content Professor Pebble as well. I'm going to move on to the angry student now. So I'm a PhD student who's marking this work. My name is Amber, and this was a really frustrating essay to mark. I felt that this student was really constantly emailing me all the time. I'd get emails at 2 in the morning on a Saturday morning when I'm meant to be actually doing my own life and living my own life. They kind of asked a lot of questions that I don't even know the answer to. How am I meant to know where they go to for, I don't know, mental health support? I'm not paid for that. I don't have a clue. I'm just a PhD student trying to kind of get through the day. I also felt that they wouldn't treat me this way if I were a proper academic. I feel like they treat me differently because I am this PhD student, and that they kind of exploit that, and it makes me feel even more exploited than I already am. So I'm angry.
Yeah. So my name is Ara. I'm the student who submitted this piece of work, and honestly, I don't know how the marker felt when they marked this. I know my marker, my lecturer, academic staff, the person in charge of this assignment, they're PhD students, so I know that they're busy. I get it. Like, all students are busy, particularly PhD, doctorate candidates, whatever you call them. They're all really busy. I get it. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know what I need to do. I have asked for feedback, and I thought I understood the feedback. That's the thing. I read the feedback, and I thought I actioned it, and then I didn't get an improvement. I didn't lose anything, but I didn't improve either. So I asked again, and I sort of got snobbed off. Not in a way that you could say you were snobbed off, but wasn't helpful at all. And I just feel really, discontented with this experience because, I'm really trying, and I get that other people are really busy, but I don't know what else to do about this. And I don't want to be that person who's like, well, if I had a proper professor, it would be fine. But sometimes I wonder, was there another member of staff that I could have gone to for help? Because I didn't really see one, and it's all just sort of, I don't know if it came across in the assignment, and maybe that's why it's been marked not as what I thought it could be, but I think what stings is I'm really annoyed because I thought I knew what I was doing, I thought I interpreted it right, but I still didn't get what I thought I should have got. So not a happy camper.
And then we have the elated students. So I'm Dr. Acorn, and this is my first permanent role, and I'm really excited to have this job. I have a lot of international students, and a lot of them come as postgraduates. I have no idea how they got on the course because they don't speak proper English, and it's just frustrating for me to lecture these students who I don't know. But that's great because I don't see colour at all. It doesn't exist for me, so that's fine. I'm attending all the unconscious bias training. I'm starting my PG cert, and I'm learning a lot about how to be inclusive in my practice. And I think that the student got this great grade, and I just think it's amazing given that, English is their second language.
So my name is Amy, and I'm an international student. And when I got the results back, I was really conflicted, but outwardly I'm pretty sure I projected that I was really happy because that was the majority emotion. But not because I felt like I deserved it, but more of a relieved, oh, I really thought I messed that up. So checked it, got a good grade. I don't know if I understand why I got a good grade, but I'm not going to question that. But at the same time, the communication between me and the professor is it's a bit difficult because I'm really trying to reach out, and I can tell that this professor, they mean really well. They're clearly trying their best to attend to the trainings that they've had, that I know that they've had because the university has told us about it and asked us for our feedback. So it's a difficult spot all around because I got a good grade for what I thought I should have got anyway. So I don't want to be that person who goes kicking the stones when it's not needed, but at the same time it's not quite right. But I can't say that because then it's well, what are you happy for? There's so many missed lines and mixed messages going on here. It's quite difficult to think about, but projecting the happiness is good enough, I guess.
So having listened into these perspectives a little bit, what we'd like you to do, and if we could just move on to the next slide, please, is we'd like you to go back to the 5 original students, and we'd like you to, in little groups, think about the different perspectives. So either in a couple of the students that we've not looked at yet, and don't worry, we'll bring back the 5 students. The ones that we've not looked at yet, maybe kind of think about the experiences that are going on both from a staff perspective and also a student perspective, and just listening into those different perspectives will kind of be an interesting conversation to have. For those of you online, I'm really sorry you can't discuss it with each other, but hopefully in your own head you can be thinking about some of those perspectives, and if you can jot down ideas and post them in the chat, it would be a nice way for you to see each other's. So we're going to go back at just the next slide. We'll have the 5 students, and I have no idea what time it is, but if we maybe give you about 10 minutes to just discuss those in either pairs or a large group, or if you want to just sit quietly on your own, that's fine as well, and think about the student perspectives. So if we could just bring your conversations to a close. We've actually given you slightly under 10 minutes, but that's fine because I think we've got quite a lot to say. I might just ask if people wouldn't mind if we could just go back to the 5 students and think about those perspectives. And I wonder if there was anything in your groups or in your discussions that was maybe a little bit contentious or surprising that you might like to share with the rest of us.
Feedback Q&A part. Please interact.
Yes.
I just wondered if the ideal was for all 5 students to be content, because that's probably not what they all need. Oh, thanks. Just a question of whether, I suppose, the ideal scenario would it be for all 5 students to be content with their grade, or everyone to be happy, because that's not necessarily going to happen, because everybody's coming from a different place. We don't know who was coming down in their grade from the previous submission, they were up in the grade. There's so many what ifs and yeah, but I suppose the question, can't expect everyone to respond the same either. So there's too many variables in it to be able to say very much.
And I think there's something about I heard this great phrase last week about the happification of higher education. We're not necessarily seeking that happification, but there is something about the kind of how students feel then, and so perhaps bringing the 5 of them into a conversation with each other would be a good one. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, it's really just an observation actually around I think I immediately recognised the different student types, but it took a bit longer to recognise the staff types, and that was a really important personal message for me in terms of, there are different types of students that respond and behave differently for some reasons that we're aware of and some that we're not, but actually also just remembering that there's the variety of staff perspectives as well, and maybe I didn't connect with that quite as much.
Thank you for that. And I think the staff perspective was something when Jasmine and I were talking about this, and she was saying, really, is that a thing? Would that be the point of view? And I said, well, yes, actually, it would be.
I want to have my happy naivety.
Because it is, our staff are exhausted, burnt out, a lot of them in very precarious situations, and we're putting them under very demanding marking loads, and that's not fair on our students, as we see. So it is a really interesting perspective. But there are issues, huge issues, as we all know, to unravel around assessment and feedback and how we can support, that work more broadly. So, thank you.
I think I surprised colleagues by saying, I'm glad the students had a reaction, which means they actually looked at their grade and looked at their feedback. Because I taught a module last year where I told the students, grade's right, feedback's out, and by a week later only 20% had actually checked it. So I was actually quite glad. I'd rather have an angry student than an apathetic one.
That's interesting, because we have a group chat for my actual undergrad degree course mates, and most of our consternation about grades is, where are the grades? Why are they not up yet? Not because we're, hounding the professors, lecturers and whatnot, but we're just sort of anxious about it because people want to know, because they want to, have a reaction in the first place. So I don't know if that's, isolated to different disciplines or different year groups, but anecdotally from my side of it, it's a bit different.
Hi there, I'm pretty new to the marking game, so to speak. And I have a rather difficult, maybe contentious question about sometimes I don't know where to draw the line between if a student has a second language and maybe their grammar and things like that isn't quite up to scratch. So where's the line between allowing sort of maybe international students or something, that bit of leeway, and sort of clamping down and making sure that there's a high standard of academic writing. So that's something that maybe I'm not quite sure about in terms of decolonising the curriculum.
So thank you for that question. And as someone who taught languages, I found that often my international students had much better English than my Scottish students that I was teaching languages to, so it's an interesting one. But it raises that whole interesting question, and it almost gets back to the purpose of university. Are we wanting to bring students to university to teach them to think and write in a way that is meaningless outside of the academy, or are we wanting them to think and write express their ideas and exchange views and listen to the views of others in a way that's meaningful? And that almost brings us then back to assessments. Why are we doing essays when that's not necessarily what we need beyond that? So and this is why I think the decolonial work is so important, because it gets us to question every single aspect of our academic practice, whether it's the curriculum, whether it's assessment, whether it's our own assumptions, whether it's how we're teaching rather than what we're teaching. So do you know what I mean? It's almost, and I don't know if you know Helen Sword's work, but Helen Sword is a New Zealand writer, and she has this website which is basically talks a lot about the zombie nouns that we use in English, particularly in academic English. And she's got this bullshit detector, and you put a 100-word abstract into her little bullshit detector, and most academic articles are gobbledygook. So why are we asking our students to replicate that same language when it's just a game, it's a performance, and how do we get back to something that's more meaningful? But that's a whole other topic, so thank you for raising that question. Ruth.
I was really most interested in the elated student and the PhD student who was doing marking. So the two things for me was the student who's elated and is hiding the things that they're not elated about, but also the invisibility of the work that we do when we're marking and the I don't see colour comment, and how is that replicated across everything that's going on across our universities at the time. So it was just more observations about those two very interesting acting.
Thank you. And the don't see colour comment we had to get in because it comes up again and again. We had a workshop at Edinburgh Napier the other week on decolonising the curriculum, and one of the participants came up to me afterwards and said, "Do you know what? One of our staff members said, oh, it's fine, I don't see colours." So it's really challenging that. It's really being explicit about it. But for them, that's a really helpful thing to say, because it's saying, well, I'm not prejudiced, because none of us want to acknowledge that. So, you know, I'm bringing it into the PG Certs that we do with our staff, getting rid of unconscious bias training and bringing in something much more meaningful that looks at exactly that. I mean, just seeing these student clips would be powerful enough that, you know, than anything else. I don't know if...
Yeah, for the tiny little part about the elated part of being a student and you get a good grade, but there's some, you know, some misgivings, not in a negative way, but just something that's not quite adding up. And the whole sort of hiding it and not wanting to come forward, even though it may or may not affect your grade or affect how you're seen by your professors or how you interact with your assignments in the future. A lot of that, I find, comes up with discussions I have with my mates they have some sort of questioning of like worthiness and value, not necessarily of themselves as individuals or even of themselves in the academic system as students, but there's a questioning of applied value when they look at the assignment that they're doing, the work that they've created, and the other works that they've interacted with in order to do that assignment. And the response that they get, it feels like something's not quite adding up, and that can be a whole multitude of factors between, you know, their background and then some like work in the assignment that they've had to put together and something's not quite adding up, or maybe they've had a response and they feel it could be as simple as I feel like I've worked harder and I didn't get a good enough grade, or vice versa. A lot of the misgivings where students don't feel, in my experience, they don't feel able or comfortable to come forward and voice these, even in an anonymous feedback form, comes up with the equation of worth. Because if I question the worth of anything that I'm doing, it then leads on to I'm questioning myself, or I'm questioning my position. Am I worth it to be here as a student? And it doesn't even mean self-destructively. It just leads to a lot of questioning that a lot of people aren't mentally ready to deal with, and that's not even a slight against their mental capacity or ability in that moment. It's just a case of life. So a lot of the time I find that that's what happens, but of course you need to speak to more students about that.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we probably have time for one more. Sorry. Yes. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, thanks for the session. I want to ask about one extra response, not the ones there, the ones that are silent and just accumulating over the years.
Yeah.
And when they expose was all or mix between what you have, like confused, angry. And we can see that through the surveys that it happens mid of the year or mid of semester and end of semester. They don't respond to anything.
Yeah.
They just staying silent across all the years of education until they reach the final year and they got shocked by some bad assessment or from their perspective. So how we deal with this one actually, which you will explode as an emotionalist, it's like atomic bomb.
So to speak.
I mean, I think that question of student engagement and the silent students and almost how do we reach those students is something we're all grappling with across the sector, particularly in the last couple of years. But in a way, the ways that we currently evaluate or look to get feedback from our students they're not working. They're either formal, or we were talking about our student rep system earlier, which, as wonderful as it is, doesn't necessarily represent the views of all the students that we need to speak to. We've also got, fascinating speaking particularly to international students, like you were saying about, well, I don't trust this system. If I say something, they say it's anonymous, but how do I know? I don't want to complain until I've got my mark. And So running anonymous focus groups led by students is a very good way of getting actual, real stories, if you like. But I mean, if anyone has the answer, then that would be great. But certainly, let's not even go down the whole NSS road and what data that tells us, because that data is not going to help any of that, I think. Thank you. Will we move on?
Yeah.
So just on the next slide, we're almost done, don't worry. We'll have lots of chance to discuss afterwards. The so what, which is always so important, all of these sessions. So what does this mean for all of us? I think there's some really interesting questions about the teacher and the role of the teacher. And as a sector, we focus so much on learning and on facilitation of learning, and that is important, yes. But in that, where is the teacher identity, and how much time do we spend really developing and focusing on that? And I don't know if any of you know Gert Bista's work, but he talks of the gift of teaching in a really interesting way. So where's the magic that happens between a staff, a teacher and students in the room? And I think revisiting that and challenging teachers' assumptions is a really important step in that. The students and how we welcome them into our teaching spaces as opposed to our learning spaces is important, and I don't know if you would add anything to that.
It's important, definitely. I think the addition of students into these spaces when it comes to not just discussion, but like when you invite the students into these spaces, as you should be, but then again I'm a student so I'd be biased, when you invite the students into these spaces, I feel like there should be an emphasis on the sort of protected nature of that position, not in that they should be allowed to just say what they want and consequences be ignored, but more of a, we're aware that there's an imbalance in this environment. You can bring all the students you want into a room, but it doesn't change the fact that there's going to be a power exchange between a teacher and a student. And when I say protection, I mean at the very least an awareness of that power, in that that's going to prevent some students from speaking up, and in other ways it will embolden some students to speak up, which will then lead to the students that you hear, even from the ones you've already invited into the space, self-selecting amongst a specific, set of temperaments who feel comfortable in those spaces. So I feel that when you invite students into the spaces, having a degree of communicated protectedness in that manner would be really, really helpful, and have us generate a much wider repertoire of responses when it comes to engaging with students.
And I suppose that gets us back to this importance of relations, and there's a lot of talk of relational pedagogies just now and how we can kind of work with them. But a lot of this comes back to Ngozi Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian author who talks about our single stories and the danger of those single stories. So kind of revisiting them both as staff and students together is a really important way. And I've been drawn to after the Danish escapade, the kind of Scandinavian thinking around higher education, and this idea of the importance of going into the darkness of higher education and exploring it and acknowledging it, and not just trying to focus on the kind of happy side of it all. And there is hope. And I think if we move on to the next slide, we can talk about then the continued work that we're doing. And I'm not going to dwell on this because that's maybe less important. It's not important, but we've talked about that quite a bit. And just moving on to the next slide then, which is almost around how much this work is about, how we teach, more perhaps than what we teach, and how we teach with our students. And this idea, I suppose, again, touching back on what the keynote was pointing out about the plurality and diversity of voices in there. And I just wanted to end with this final quotation, which I just think is wonderful. I'm going to have to read it out to you because I love it so much. And in the midst of this terrible despair, which is now, this is us just now, in the terrible despair, the pandemic, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Thank you for listening. You're free to go lighter in exhibit.
Thanks for listening.